Well, a big welcome to everyone who is watching this or listening to our podcast. With me today is Dr. Gary Chapman, the author of The 5 Love Languages. It's a great privilege and honor to have you with us, Dr. Gary. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Andy. It's good to be with you.
For starters, please, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the ministry before we sort of dive into hearing more about the 5 love languages and how it can impact and outwork through us. Yourself, what about you, Dr. Gary? Who is Dr. Gary?
Well, I live, of course, in North Carolina on the East Coast of the U.S., and I work on a church staff. I've been on the same staff for over 40 years.
Wow.
Doing marriage counseling and family counseling, as well as doing some of the speaking when the pastor calls on me, and leading small groups with couples. And so family life is pretty much the heart of my ministry and has been for all these years.
Wow, that's incredible. That is so good. So the book, The 5 Love Languages, it's very well known, as I was even just in the recent week talking to different people about doing this interview. They were, oh, wow, okay, I've read that. There's not too many people that, when you mention it, that are not known, but an overview, how did the book come about and how did you come about writing this and discover what you put into the book?
Yeah, well, it actually grew out of my counseling. Years ago, a couple came in to see me whom I did not know, had never met them. And the wife sat down and the husband sat down and she said, Dr. Chapman, let me just tell you a little bit about us. She said, we don't argue. We don't believe in arguing. We don't have any money problems. And she went on with 2 or 3 more positive things. And I was beginning to wonder, did they come in here to tell me what a good marriage they have? But then she started crying and she said, but the problem is, I just don't feel any love coming from him. We're like roommates. We live in the same house. We're civil, but there's nothing going on between us. He lives his life, I live my life, and I just feel empty. And I don't know how long I can go on like this. I looked at her husband and he said, I don't understand that. I do everything I can to show her that I love her. And she still says she doesn't feel loved. Right. And I said, well, what do you do to show your love? He said, well, I get home from work before she does, so I start the evening meal. And some nights I have it ready when she gets home. If not, she'll help me. And then we eat together. And after we eat, he said, I wash the dishes. And he said, every Thursday night I vacuum the floors. And every Saturday I wash the car and I mow the grass and I help her with the laundry. And he went on. I was beginning to wonder, what does this woman do? It sounded to me like he did everything.
Right.
And he said, I do all of that, and yet she says she doesn't feel loved. Look back at her, and she said, Dr. Chapman, he's right. He's a hardworking man, but we don't ever talk. We haven't talked in 20 years. Wow. He's always mowing the grass, washing the dishes, vacuuming the floor, always doing something. We don't ever talk. And I realized that here was a sincere husband who was doing everything he knew to express his love to his wife, and a wife who didn't get it. Right. And after that experience, I had over and over again, I had similar experiences in my office. And I knew there had to be a pattern to it, Andy, but I had no idea what it was. So eventually I took time to sit down and read several years of notes that I made when I was counseling. Right. And asked myself, when someone said, I feel like my spouse doesn't love me, what did they want?
Right.
What were they complaining about? And their answers fell into 5 categories. And I later called them the 5 love languages. And I started using that in my counseling. That if you want her to feel love, you got to speak love in her language. If you want him to feel love, you got to speak love in his language. And I would help couples discover each other's language, challenge them to go home and try it. And sometimes they would come back in 3 weeks and say, Gary, this is changing everything. The whole climate's different now. And then I started using it in small groups of couples, and the same thing would happen. And probably 5 years later, I thought, if I could put this concept in a book, write it in the language of the common person, leave out the psychological jargon, maybe I could help a lot of couples that I would never have time to see in my office.
Right.
So that's why I wrote the book. And little did I know that it would sell over 14 million copies in the U.S., be translated in over 50 languages around the world, which says to me, all humans desire to be loved.
Yes.
And I think most people agree. That's our deepest emotional need on the human level, is to feel loved by the significant people in our lives. And the love languages helps you do that effectively.
For those watching or those listening, how would you encourage them? Maybe some are aware of the book and they have not, so I strongly encourage those to get the book and read that as a start. But how would you encourage people to discover our own personal love language? What's some of the indicators?
First of all, of course, you have to have the concept of the love languages. You know, what are the love languages? I'll just mention them briefly, and we can talk more if you like.
Yeah, sure.
One is words of affirmation. For some people, this is what makes them feel loved.
Yeah.
One is gifts. One is acts of service. That's what the gentleman was doing when he was washing dishes and all those things. One is quality time, giving them your undivided attention. And one is physical touch.
Right.
So here are three simple ways to discover which of these speaks more deeply to you emotionally, and also to discover the other person's language. First of all, observe your behavior and observe their behavior. How do they typically respond to other people? Because we tend to speak our own love language.
Yes.
So if you hear your spouse giving other people encouraging words, then likely that's what they want. They're doing for others what they would like others to do to them. If your spouse is one who's always giving gifts to people, likely that's what they'd like to receive. So observe your behavior, observe their behavior. Secondly, what do you complain about most often? What do they complain about most often? You know, if you say to your spouse, I don't think you would ever touch me if I didn't initiate it, you're telling them that physical touch is your love language. If you go on a trip and you come home and they say, you didn't bring me anything, they're telling you that gifts is their language. So, or if you hear your spouse saying things like, I can't ever please you, they're telling you words of affirmation is their language, and what they hear from you is condemning words. So listen to your own complaints. What do you complain about? One wife said to her husband, I just feel like we just don't ever spend any time together. I feel like we're two ships passing in the dark. She's telling him clearly her language is quality time. You see, when she said, we don't ever talk, the lady said that, she didn't mean they didn't talk about logistics, you know, who's going to take the kids to school. She means we don't ever sit down, look at each other, and ask each other, honey, how are things going for you? What have you been thinking? What have you been feeling lately? You know, the quality time is giving them your undivided attention. So what do you complain about? The third question is, what do you request most often? If you're saying to your spouse, honey, could we take a walk after dinner? You're asking for quality time.
Yeah.
If you say, honey, could you give me a back rub? You're asking for physical touch. If they get ready to go on a business trip and you say, be sure and bring me a surprise, your gifts is your language. If you do those three things, observe your behavior, what do you complain about most often, what do you request most often, you can pretty well figure out your love language and someone else's love language. Now, Andy, you know, there is a free quiz online.
Right.
If you go to 5lovelanguages.com, the number 5,
Yes.
5lovelanguages.com, there's a free quiz for married couples.
Right.
In which you take the quiz, answer questions, and it tells you what your primary love language is, what your secondary love language is, and also the least important to you. And there's a quiz not only for married couples, there's a quiz for single adults, there's a quiz for children, and a quiz for teenagers. So hopefully the whole family can learn each other's love language and begin to speak it. It changes the climate, not only of the marriage, but of all the family relationships.
That's brilliant. I was going to lean into that and ask, many years ago when I was children's pastoring and I had read your book, I discovered this, that I was leading a children's ministry and coming in on a Sunday morning, there was so many children, and I actually started to take mental notes of which children's children reacted to different love languages. So therefore, I could walk in and say to the little, hey, nice bow in your hair, and she'd light up. You know, rough and tumble with the boys, and how you doing, those physical touch. And then you get to the ones that it's time, and it takes time. And we had to sit down and you'd play a card game or something with the kids, or an activity. And I remember other children bouncing up and saying, hey, can I join in? And I'd say, oh, we're full here, but man, that's a cool shirt. And they'd go, oh, thanks. And off they'd go, you know, tank full.
Absolutely. It works with children as well as adults. You know, when I'm talking to parents, I say this. The question is not, do you love your children?
Yeah.
The question is, do your children feel loved?
Right. And that's what I was going to ask. With children, is it that language? It's a language. Is it there from a young age? Does it shift and change, or how do you adapt within the children? You're identifying what that is. Does it change with experience over the years?
You know, I think the love language is there very early in a child's life. In fact, I'm certain that by 4 years of age, you can determine a child's primary love language.
Yeah, wow. Okay.
How do they respond to you? For example, my son's love language is physical touch. When he was that age, I would come home in the afternoon. He would run to the door, grab my leg, and climb on me. Right. He's touching me because he wants to be touched. Yes. Our daughter at that age never did that. Yeah. She would say, Daddy, come into my room. I want to show you something. Right. She wanted quality time. She wanted my undivided attention. Yes. And when they got to be teenagers, my daughter would say, Dad, can we take a walk after dinner? Wow. She's asking me for quality time. And I would say to her, honey, I'd be glad to as soon as I wash dishes for your mother, because my wife's language is acts of service. Okay. Make mother happy, then I'll walk with you. Yeah. My son would never walk with me. Yep. He said, walking is dumb. You're not going anywhere. If you're going somewhere, drive. Yeah. What he would say is, Dad, can we play basketball after dinner? And the way we played basketball in the backyard, it was physical. Okay. So I think the love language tends to stay with us for a lifetime, like many other personality traits. But I do think that as adults, there may be seasons of life in which another love language may tend to jump to the top. Right. For example, a mother who has 2 preschool children, acts of service may not be her primary love language, but during those years, it will likely jump to the top. Yeah, right. Because she's overwhelmed. And so it'll become more important. I think also for many people, their number 1 love language and number 2 are very, very close. And if they get enough of number 1, they may begin to think, I don't know, I think number 2 has become number 1. But if you stop doing number 1, they'll quickly say, oh, no, that's still my primary. So I think it does tend to stay with us for a lifetime, but in certain situations, it may change, you know, for a while or a season. But I think it does tend to stay with us for a lifetime.
Another question I have, and bringing God into the picture, into this space, how can God speak to us through our love languages, or how is spirituality involved within the context of love languages?
Well, you know, Andy, people kept asking me, what is God's love language? Right. So I just started going through the scriptures. Yeah. And I discovered God speaks all 5 love languages very fluently, Old Testament and New Testament. So I actually wrote a book called God Speaks Your Love Language, right. In which I look at conversion experiences, that is how people become Christians, especially as adults. Yeah. And there's a strong parallel between their love language and how they experience God's love. Wow. And I looked in the Bible, and I looked in church history, and looked in contemporary experience. For example, Saul on the road to Damascus had a physical experience. The light, he was blinded, he fell to the ground. Yeah. I mean, God got his attention by physical touch. Yeah. And today, many people have that kind of experience. They will say, you know, I was sitting there, I was listening to the sermon, and I started weeping, and my body started shaking. I mean, I couldn't control myself, and I knew God was talking to me. Yeah. Well, not everybody has that kind of experience, but if physical touch is their language, that may well be true for you. Yeah. So I demonstrate that God does speak our love language. He loves us. He wants us to know that he loves us. And often he speaks our love language. If words of affirmation, for example, is our language, it'll be like Martin Luther. When he, was trying so hard to please God and work his way into God's acceptance. And then he read in the book of Romans, the just shall live by faith. And he said, paradise broke in my soul. I don't have to work to make this happen. God has done the work for me. So, and then when we become believers, we tend to express our love to God in our own love language. What did Martin Luther do with his whole life? Words, words, words. He wrote sermons. He wrote commentaries. He wrote the 95 Theses. He wrote hymns. I mean, it was words for him, So anyway, it's a very fascinating study of how God speaks our love language and how we respond to God most naturally in speaking our own love language.
Yeah, that is brilliant. It's as you were telling that story, I reflected upon my own conversion, and with words of affirmation, just that strong word of purpose and God saving me. And it wasn't that works. It is how I first heard the gospel message at 15. And then now even outworking that call through the predominant gift that I receive, love, and expressing my love to God. So that's so interesting. What was that, the book that you have written, the second one in that is God Speaks Your Love Language?
Yes, God Speaks Your Love Language. That's the title.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Look, I'd love for those that are watching and again listening to obviously explore that, and not just for you, but for your family, to help them shape direction and the faith formation for your children, your teenagers, and for you and your spouse, which would be brilliant. Last question is really, how is that life and we touched on it then, and spirituality shaped by the love languages? Like, how do we, I guess, allow God to shape our spirituality through the love languages?
Yeah, well, here's what I think happens often, Andy. Let's say acts of service is our language, and we came to Christ because we realized the greatest act of service God ever did was sending Christ to die on the cross for us. And that's what drew us to him. If that is our love language, then when we love God, we're the ones who volunteer to work in the soup kitchen. We volunteer to go do things for people.
Yes.
From our perspective, it's doing things for people, that expresses our love to God. And it's just natural for us. And so here's 2 points I want to make. One is, we sometimes judge other people because they don't express their love to God in the same way we do.
Right.
For example, sometimes people will, acts of service people will say to words people, well, if you really love God, you be out here doing something and not just giving God words, But here's the other aspect. That acts of service person volunteers to work in the soup kitchen. And on Thursday night, they'll go down, and every time they dip beans, they look up at the person in front of them and they see Jesus. Because they remember Jesus said, as often as you do it to the least of these, you do it to me. And it's such a wonderful experience because they're loving God by serving these people. But that was 10 years ago. Now they still go to the soup kitchen.
Right.
But they're not really thinking about Jesus. They're just dipping beans.
Yes.
It's because what they do on Thursday night. And God never intended our relationship just to become mundane or routine.
Yes.
So what I suggest to people is, try some new dialects of your own language.
Yeah.
First of all, you can still dip beans, but maybe go trim shrubs for someone, or mow grass for someone, or do something else for someone that can't do it. And then maybe try some of the other love languages that just are not very comfortable for you, but give them a try. And what it does, it wakes up our relationship with God. It's a very exciting study and a very certain reality for many people, that their walk with God has become just routine. They're going through good things, but it's just routine. And God wants it to be alive. And if we try new dialects and new languages, it can be vital and vibrant.
Well, that is brilliant. Well, our time has come, and I just wanted to, once again, Dr. Chapman, say thank you for joining us and speaking through this for those that are listening and watching. Let me encourage you to get the book, The 5 Love Languages. We've also got God Speaks to You, or Speaks Your Language. And as well, you can do that test for you, your spouse, your family, your kids, your teenagers, at the website, The 5 Love Languages, which is just fantastic. But Dr. Chapman, thank you once more. Thank you for your life's work. And you're right, when you said many years ago, if you put this into writing, you'll be able to help more people in your office. Well, we've brought all of us to your office and learn from you today. So thank you once more for joining us.
Well, you are welcome, Andy. It was good to be with you, and keep up the good work. I appreciate what you're doing. God bless you.
Thanks so much.